Hundreds of women were slowly poisoned by painting watch faces with glowing radium. Their jaws literally rotting away from the inside out. A gruesome symptom of radium poisoning that would ultimately kill many of them. But here's where it gets dark. These women, known as the Radium Girls, were not only aware of the risks, but were actually encouraged to moisten their brushes with their tongues, thereby ingesting small amounts of radium daily, which made their bodies glow in the dark. A morbid side effect that was both fascinating and terrifying. This was the United States in the early 1900s, where women's rights were still in their infancy, and the pursuit of profit often outweighed human life, setting the stage for one of the most horrific industrial disasters in history. The company responsible, the United States Radium Corporation, had been using radium to paint watch faces since 1917, and by the early 1920s, the effects of radium poisoning were starting to show, but the company chose to ignore the warning signs. And this is where everything fell apart. The Radium Girls, mostly young women from poor backgrounds, were employed to paint the glow-in-the-dark faces of watches and other instruments. A job that required great skill and attention to detail, but also exposed them to lethal doses of radium, a fact that was well known to the company, but kept hidden from the workers. The women were instructed to point their brushes with their tongues, thereby ingesting small amounts of radium daily, which led to a range of horrific symptoms, including anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would eventually kill many of them. The first reported case of radium poisoning was in 1922, when a woman named Catherine Donahue, a former Radium Girl, began to experience severe pain and disfigurement. But her case was just the tip of the iceberg. And as more women fell ill, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Nobody talks about this part, but the company actually hired doctors to examine the women and determine the cause of their illnesses. But these doctors were often on the company's payroll, and their findings were therefore biased. And this is where the story takes a sinister turn. As the women's health began to deteriorate, they started to experience strange and terrifying symptoms, including glowing in the dark, a side effect of radium poisoning that was both fascinating and terrifying. And their bodies began to deteriorate at an alarming rate, with many suffering from anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw. But here's where it gets even darker. The company, United States Radium Corporation, knew about the dangers of radium poisoning, but chose to ignore them, and instead, continued to employ the women, often in appalling conditions, with little to no protective gear, and no warning of the risks they were taking. The women, many of whom were young and desperate for work, were often forced to sign contracts that prohibited them from discussing their working conditions or seeking medical attention, a fact that would later become a major factor in the lawsuit that would change the course of women's rights history. And this is where the story becomes a fight for justice, as the Radium Girls, despite their poor health and lack of resources, decided to take on the company and fight for their rights. The lawsuit, which was filed in 1928, was a landmark case that would expose the company's negligence and greed, and bring attention to the plight of the Radium Girls, who had been suffering in silence for years. The lawsuit was led by Catherine Donahue, who had become a leading figure in the fight for justice, and was supported by the women's rights movement, which saw the case as a symbol of the struggles faced by women in the workplace. The trial was a dramatic and emotional affair, with many of the Radium Girls testifying about their experiences and the horrific symptoms they had suffered, and the company's lawyers trying to discredit them and downplay the risks of radium poisoning. But the evidence was overwhelming, and in the end, the court ruled in favor of the women, awarding them significant damages and forcing the company to take responsibility for its actions. And this is where the story reaches its climax, as the Radium Girls finally get the justice they deserve, but at a great personal cost. The aftermath of the lawsuit was marked by a mixture of relief and tragedy, as many of the Radium Girls had already died or were dying from radium poisoning, and those who survived were left to live with the consequences of their exposure, including chronic illness and disability. The case, however, had a lasting impact on women's rights and industrial safety, as it highlighted the need for better working conditions and greater protection for workers, particularly women, who were often exploited and marginalized. The Radium Girls' story also inspired a new generation of activists and advocates, who continued to fight for justice and equality in the workplace. And their legacy can still be seen today in the many laws and regulations that protect workers' rights and prevent industrial disasters like the one that occurred at the United States Radium Corporation. And this is where the story comes full circle, as the Radium Girls' fight for justice becomes a beacon of hope for future generations. The story of the Radium Girls is a powerful reminder of the human cost of industrial greed and neglect, and the importance of fighting for justice and equality in the workplace. And it's a story that will continue to haunt us, a reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Subscribe for more stories like this, and join us next time as we explore more dark and disturbing tales from history.